Welcome everybody to this NIHR School for Social Care Research webinar. I'm David Abbott, I'm chairing the session today. I'm from the University of Bristol and I'm also one of the Associate Directors of the School for Social Care Research. And this is one of our fortnightly webinars and you're all very welcome. Okay, so today's webinar, the title is Examining the Economic Case for a Range of Adult Social Care Interventions, and we have 5 speakers to talk about their work together. I'm delighted to welcome Martin Knapp, Michela Tinelli, Annette Bauer, Helen Weatherly and Ben Schlaepfer. And without further ado, I'll hand over to the first person who's going to make a start.
Thank you, David. So the first person is me, Martin Knapp. So what I'm going to do is just go through, explain what we're doing in terms of the structure for this. We're going to just, it's one presentation with 5 people speaking at different points. Just to say that 4 of us are based at the Care Policy and Evaluation Centre at LSE, and the exception is Helen Weatherly in the Centre for Health Economics at York. And you'll see different logos on different slides as we go through to reflect that. So, Michela, next slide, please. Okay, so this is the structure. So I'm going to say something to begin with about the need for economic insights, not taking too much time. By the way, I'm director of SSCR, but I'm here in my role as a researcher at LSE. And this is a project, or a couple of projects, which you'll hear about in a moment, that I've been heavily involved in. So I'll go through with some introductory comments about economic evaluation, then hand over to Michela, who's going to talk about the Essence project, which was in phase 2 of SSCR. Annette is going to highlight one of the case studies that was in Essence on advanced care planning. Helen's going to talk about work she did quite independently, I think funded or supported by NICE, scoping the evidence on social care economic evaluation. And then Ben's going to talk about some analytics from the first phase of Essence, but I think that might be helpful to people more generally in how we use web-based resources, which we're all doing much more now. And then my final bit, I've got one slide, I think, at the end, just to talk about the new project. So next slide, please. Okay, so what I put on here, it's a busy slide. Just look at the left-hand side for the moment. What does a good social care system look like? If we're thinking about social care system for any particular group of people, what would we expect it to do if it was performing well? Well, it would meet needs. Needs could be defined by the individual, by the system, by family members, or all of them. It would respond to personal preferences. It would respect the rights and dignity and culture of the individual and family. It would try or aim to achieve equity or fairness in terms of whether people get treatment, or put treatment there, treatment or care, payments for that care, the outcomes of their care. It would safeguard people who might be thought to be at particular risk of harm, for example, and it would encourage social and community cohesion. Now, there are many other things it might try to do. Just wanted to give some illustration of what we would see, see a good social care system as looking like. And then on the right-hand side, I've added some economics criteria, if you like. We would probably want a good social care system to be efficient in the way in which it uses resources. We want it to be affordable. We've got the resources to deliver it today. We want it to be sustainable financially, if you like, resource-wise in the long term. And perhaps when we're thinking about changes, we might be encouraged by decision makers to think about something which is going to generate savings. Not in its own right, but if we're thinking about introducing new services, would they then replace perhaps in some way services or needs, services or supports in other respects? Next slide, please. So why then do we need economic evidence of that kind? And I think it's pretty obvious, and I've just put up a slide. I must have used this slide a zillion times in my life. just draws attention to the fact that resources are scarce. And they're not scarce because we have austerity government, not scarce because we're spending lots of money on tackling COVID. They're scarce always. There will never be enough resources to meet every need or to respond to every preference. And that's why, as a society, it's not somebody else, it's us as a society. We have to choose how to get the best out of our available resources. And that's where economics comes in. And so I put at the bottom of the slide there, any new service or intervention is looked at very carefully, and we say, is it effective? Is it affordable? Is it sustainable? Does it save money? Is it cost effective? Those are the points I raised earlier. Next slide, please. So this is a very busy slide coming up here, and I put on here many of the uses of what I could call economics evidence or economic evaluation evidence. And I put in that little yellow box on the right-hand side there, the point of emphasis that different uses of economic evidence may require different types of analysis. And so a piece of research, for example, that might be done to address the first need there, comparison between different providers or between local authorities or for monitoring policy and so on. For that use, it may be that we need one particular type of evaluation or type of evidence, but for a different use, down there, point E, marketing of products, for example, by manufacturers, that might require a different type of evidence. But in that list, I'm not going to go through everyone in the list there, you can see a range of reasons why we might need to bring in economic evidence as well as evidence on needs, on outcomes, on preferences, and so on. What we're trying to do, and you'll hear about this in a moment in the project that we've done already and the new project which starts next week, what we're trying to do in those pieces of work is to provide a way to help people in all those different areas on that slide to understand what evidence is available, maybe create some new evidence for them, certainly help them to find their way through what is known. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now this is a busy slide, and I'm just going to say a few words about it. We're not going to get into technical stuff in this presentation. We're going to talk about the type of evidence that may be available and how we can collate it together, how we have been pulling it together. But what I put on here are I've listed 7 different types of economic evaluation. And the first thing to say is that economists, whether they're working in the health field, the social care field, whatever, do not agree. They do not agree what the types of evaluation are. They use different labels for the same things. They use the same labels for different things sometimes. So this is just a set of labels and some quick explanations as to what we mean by economic evaluation. Now, in each case, each of those types of evaluation, they're labeled in the left-hand column. Each of them would measure costs, either narrowly, such as the costs of the social care system narrowly defined, or perhaps broadly, looking at the costs to the wider society, including the cost, if you like, of the time that unpaid carers might provide. So each of them measures costs, and then they differ in that middle column in terms of the outcomes that they would use, and then I put some comments on the right-hand side. So what we're primarily interested in this project is a proper economic evaluation, which has got costs, and it's also looking at the outcomes for the individuals. So if we go to that first line, cost minimization analysis, it measures cost but no outcomes, it's very limited use. The second line in the table, cost effectiveness analysis, it measures a single, I call it primary outcome. That might be something like needs met, or if it's health condition, symptoms reduced, or it might be activities of daily living supported, or something like that. The sort of natural so-called measures that we would think about when looking at social care service. When you get to the third line, that's looking at more than one of those outcomes together. Cost consequences. When you get to the fourth line, cost utility, this is where you are reducing those different outcomes into a single generic measure called utility. And anybody who's been around in the UK for a while would know about QALYs, quality adjusted life years, and that's the metric that, for example, NICE would use to allow comparisons between different areas. And then I'll say more about just quickly the last 3. Cost benefit, you're now measuring the outcomes in monetary terms, which is very, very difficult to do. There are many people now getting interested in well-being as your main outcome, if you like. Whether that's a separate type of evaluation, I'm not really sure, but I put it there separately for the moment. And then you may well have heard of a social return on investment. And my view on that is it is not different. It is not different from the evaluations above, although people that do SROI sometimes suggest that it is. Okay, I'm going to stop there and hand over to Michela.
Thank you so much, Martin. Good afternoon, everybody. With the next 7 slide, we are aiming to present you the Essence project and the toolkit. All different information, in-depth information has been already published and shared via the website. We are very much welcome to visit the website if you haven't done so. And hopefully the next slide will push you a bit more, intrigue you a bit more to source the information that we have already published as part of the project. Briefly, what is ECSEN, the Economic of Social Care Compendium? The aims of the project were to gather economic evidence around adult social care and make the evidence available, useful, accessible to decision makers in England to inform decisions. We wanted also to provide training, learning materials to improve better understanding of the evidence of the economics. And of course, given this mapping exercise, we wanted also to identify gaps in evidence and hopefully see whether the academics and researchers could be involved in future research through modeling and new experiments. So first of all, we didn't want to reinvent the wheel. We are well aware of different sources, and of course, these were the ones that we looked at first. I'm thinking about NIHR guidelines, the School of Social Care Institute for Excellence materials, the public health toolkit, but also specific evidence produced by different research groups. We looked also at the scoping review that Helen will talk us about in a minute. All different elements were already there. Way we wanted to communicate evidence in more accessible terms, some less technical, and not just for researchers in a way. And of course, we wanted to make sure that the evidence was made available quickly. Without having to wait for the robust systems that NIHR got in place to produce evidence. So we wanted to add new evidence, newly produced but not currently mentioned in the guidance already published. And of course, we wanted also to channel different audiences, people, to relevant sources. Martin mentioned that this particular project was already concluded as part of the second phase of the School of Social Care Research, but we got a bit of news that Martin will share with us later as well. First of all, how did the Essence project work? As I mentioned, we did a lot of searches around different materials. We looked at the different documents and materials that I mentioned via NIHR guidelines and etc. We looked also at the School of Social project. This was kind of an iterative approach in a way, because we were supported by our experts throughout the process, and we consulting with them through the different something about our core or advisor group, but we were quite fortunate because we had different dialogues with different people, between researchers, experts, including local decision makers, commissioners, service providers, care practitioners, and all very much willing to help us in this sort of process. As part of the Essence toolkit that we produced with the project, we have three different elements. First of all, we have a selection of case summaries. Summary, we wanted to focus on particular interventions. They are written in non-technical language, and they provide a summary of the core set of element that we want to communicate, and I will explain to you about the structure of the summaries in a minute, and Annette will provide you an example, a practical example of a case summaries. On top of this core set of case summaries, we had a tool that as a searchable database where we you can find all sorts of source of evidence, in a sense, publications, reporting, and etc., looking into the breadth of all the inventions that we described as part of the essence. We have also a glossary looking into different technical terms that Martin, for example, mentioned in his slide before. What is a quality, what is cost effectiveness, cost utility. So first at glance explanations in non-technical terms of these key elements of economic evaluations. On top of that, we want also to share other resources such as training materials, presentation. We had workshops. I want to share publications, and for example, this webinar are actually part of this collection of resources. As I mentioned, all the different steps were completed with the support of the expert. The advisory group really helped us in the selection of the different and really guide us to keep a focus across the whole exercise. We were also quite fortunate because at the time the National Audit Office just published our organizational framework around adult social care services. So in a way we used this framework to map all the evidence that we were extracting from the different sources. As you see, we have a core set of interventions that are described as adult social care services provided by local authorities. You have an example as safeguarding, day services, on care. So we try to cover them all as much as we could, depending on the evidence available, of course, but we tried also to link to the interface of health services, welfare, housing, and leisure and well-being. So this is the complete map of interventions that we try to cover, as I said, as part of Essence. And this sort of maps is available on the website. So if you go on the website and you click on a particular box, you will be strictly directed to case summaries if they are available on their services, or any other piece of evidence, reporting and publication. So you will be guided to the full publications or just a brief abstract if the full publication is not available. What we mean by economic case. So we are trying to describe interventions that are cost effective and affordable. And we want to keep an eye on the spread of the costing, or different broad of costs and outcomes. And this is what Martin explained to us. We wanted to look at the different budgets and sectors, depending again on what was available to us, and different time periods, looking at short terms or longer term if possible. We wanted to identify direct savings, of course, if such evidence was there, looking at the different public budgets, but of course, even beyond, looking at carers, families, and the broader societal views, if we could. If direct savings evidence was not there, still we were very much willing to present any cost effectiveness gains, looking into the investment that will need to be made to secure particular gains in outcomes. There were also other type of evidence, pieces of work reporting only on cost of interventions, where in this case really we did not consider the study, although other evaluations where they included cost of interventions within their scope of evaluation. Again, these were the case where we had the piece of work presented in Essence. So here is just to give you a bit of a flavor about how what we would do with the summary and the structure of a case summary as part of our collection. First of all, we have a covering page that is a couple of lines on the website. And this is kind of presenting you in a nutshell the content of the full document. If you want to look more, you just click and you are presented with the full document and you can download the PDF. Otherwise, you can move on and look into other case summaries. Overall, the PDF or the full document covers again the cover page, but also we have additional on the content, on the context. We have information on the intervention, a brief description of what type of intervention is presented, if the intervention is effective. We want also to present any experience from people with experience of receiving the intervention, quotes, and etc. Of course, there is evidence on the cost effectiveness of this particular intervention. And where possible, we want also to discuss the quality of the evidence presented. If the particular intervention is implemented in practice, we present case studies and we present the full links of material for more in-depth exploration, and crucially there is a contact person. So in each case study, if you want to know more, if you something is not clear, you can always have someone that is your point of contact and you can refer to them, have a direct conversation with them on the material. Crucially, you have also the full list of referencing, looking into particular economic evaluation papers, the full paper if available, or just the abstract, and other useful information broader on the summary. Here is just a flavor of the different title of our case summary. Is a collection of about 20 case summaries, and later on Annette will present you one of them. As I mentioned, when the first phase of the project is concluded, but we are lucky that we have received more funding from the School of Social Care, and we are permitted to stay alive in a sense and carry on with our research. The team includes Martin leading us all. There is myself, Annette, and Helen. We were very fortunate at the start to have her as part of the advisory group, and luckily now she's helping us together with Ben, that we present later on some statistics about the Essence study. Just to reiterate, the second phase of the Essence Toolkit will continue to help decision makers to make better decisions. This is our aim, and we want to make so with 3 different elements. Looking into finding new economic evidence, making the evidence available and accessible. We want to carry on in supporting capacity building, and also we want to identify more gaps and help addressing these gaps with new evidence to come. I think it's for me acknowledging the help that we received from NIHR, our advisory group, and I think I spotted few of our advisory group members in the audience today. I'm very pleased that they are following the presentation. Of course, Aya is one of the key persons that helped us in commenting and providing revisions to our work, and I'm grateful that she's here today with us. Of course, Angie helped a lot in shaping and wrapping everything for our presentation on the website. I think I stop here, and I think is Annette next. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Michela. Hello, everyone. I'm Annette Bauer, and I'm just going to talk a bit more about one of the case studies that we did. And obviously, I'm going to present a kind of limited set of information, so there's much more information available. And the case study we chose is on advanced care planning, which I think, especially in the current situation, has become another priority in this changing a lot in terms of the context in which it is provided. But this is obviously the evidence we had at that time, which was before COVID. Next slide, please. Thanks. So briefly, we are stating for every case summary a bit of a definition of what the intervention is about, or the area of intervention. So advanced care planning is a discussion between or with the person and the family carer about their treatment wishes, which are then also recorded. The goal is to actually clarify and hopefully also adhere to the person's wishes, needs, and preferences towards end of life. And often the process leads to advanced decisions, which are in England at least legally binding, and the appointment of a lasting power of attorney, and advanced statements which are not legally binding, but which are setting out some of the preferences or treatment wishes. And the principles by which advanced care planning is provided is that it's really a process that is person-centered or should be person-centered. It's longer term, so it's not just supposed to be one meeting, and it's multidisciplinary. And the context in England is that it's legally supported. It's not a legal obligation, but it's legally supported by the Mental Capacity Act. It's recommended by NICE as well. And despite this, it's a relatively low uptake in practice. So some areas in England, I think the uptake is as low as 4%. And it's also very provided very differently in different settings, which is also typical for social care. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So what do people say about it? So people reaching end of life and family carers, although they find or recognizing that the process is challenging or find the process sometimes challenging, they do tend to want the opportunity to discuss their preference and wishes and find it overall useful. From practitioner side, it's a bit more difficult. So they are more ambivalent about it, partly because it's more difficult for them to actually know if they can implement advanced care planning or the treatment wishes that are expressed in advanced care planning. They might also have a lack of skills, and the processes in their organization might be unclear, and responsibilities are not unclear. What do we know about if it works or not? So is it effective? So we know it's effective in terms of process outcomes. So there is fairly good evidence that it increases adherence with wishes. So there's evidence that it reduces life prolonging treatments. There's also a greater likelihood of the preferred place of death, which is typically at a person's home. But there's less good evidence on outcomes, like let's say the more final outcomes to people reaching end of life and to family carers. There is evidence so that it can improve the experience of death. It can improve the symptoms towards end of life and reduce stress. And especially for the family carers, there's even some evidence from an RCT in Australia that it can reduce stress and lead to quality of life improvements measured in terms of depression and anxiety, which can even continue after the person's death. Next slide. So what does the economic evidence tell us is a good value for money? And this is primarily based on an economic study, which was a modeling study carried out for NICE by our center, which finds that it is cost effective, but we were only looking at a limited set of outcomes. In that case, we were actually only able to look at the family carers' perspective and their quality of life improvement. And what we did was a cost utility model. So that's kind of model that Martin was referring to, which measures costs and qualities. So the outcomes are measured in terms of quality adjusted life years. And we found that the cost in terms of health and social care in the advanced care plan group versus the control group were 3,748 versus 3,072. So the difference was 676. And the quality of adjusted life years gained were 0.03. So the incremental cost effectiveness ratio, and that's what you get when you divide the difference in cost of the 676 by the 0.03, was 22,533 per QALY. And according to the NICE threshold, that suggests that it's cost effective. So the thresholds are typically between 20,000 and 30,000 for NICE. So anything that falls in that kind of range is considered cost effective. And it was important to understand that the cost of the interventions were ranging very widely from 200 to just under 2,000. And so our interpretation is, and that's what you also find in terms of the evidence presented on the Essence website, is that the evidence has to be taken with some kind of caution. So there's currently no economic study that really includes all relevant costs and outcomes. So even the modeling we did had really limitations, as I said, in terms of just looking at one outcome, which was from the family carer's perspective. but we would argue that even just by looking at that outcome, you still find that it's quite likely to be cost effective. And we had an estimated probability ranging from 55 to 80%. But obviously it really depends on, and I guess that's true for most social care interventions, but we really found that it depends a lot on the contextual factors and how advanced care planning is implemented by different organizations, how much awareness there is from the people receiving the intervention, and that will all influence the acceptability and the cost effectiveness of advanced care planning. And I'm handing over to Helen, I think.
Oh, hello there all. I'm sorry, I don't think you can see me, but hopefully you can hear me okay. We have the window cleaners in, so it's probably just as well you can't see me right now. Anyway, thank you for this opportunity to briefly review the scoping review that I did with some colleagues at Centre for Health Economics, also at NICE and at the York Health Economics Consortium about 4 years ago. We also very much benefited from a virtual advisory group that included Martin Knapp, and they guided us and supported us with additional evidence and some reminders of the ongoing debates as well. So although the review didn't actually reflect the full debates, I just hope to give you a brief summary of the scoping review here. If you could just change the slide, Michela, please. So why did we undertake the scoping review? Well, there were really three main reasons. First, we wanted to understand the type of economic evaluations of social care interventions that have been undertaken to date, and also to understand sort of in what setting they'd been undertaken. So this was one of the reasons. Secondly, really to understand the findings of the studies. Today I'm really just focusing on the methods used to undertake these studies, and they're quite various and diverse, so they're very interesting to look at. And why are we interested in that? Well, thirdly, really, it's to draw lessons. So for those of us either interpreting or undertaking new economic evaluations in the area, how can we benefit from the experiences that other analysts have had in undertaking these evaluations in the past? If you could turn the slide, Michela, thanks. So what did the review find? Well, we found about 4,000 studies in total, but once we'd applied our eligibility criteria, we actually ended up with only about 30 economic evaluations of social care interventions. We found that about 2/3 of these were undertaken in the UK context, and there were a few studies undertaken in Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Australia, and the US as well. As for the different types of economic evaluations that were undertaken, Martin gave us a review of some of the definitions for these different types of economic evaluations earlier. The one that was most common was cost effectiveness analysis using natural units to measure the outcomes. So this might have included things like functional outcomes. It could have included mental health outcomes as measured, for example, by the General Health Questionnaire. But there are a whole host of different outcomes that could be included, also social care related quality of life. The next most common type of economic evaluation was the cost effectiveness analysis, and taking sort of a healthcare perspective using quality adjusted life years, the QALY. And then this would include the incremental costs alongside the incremental differences in benefits as measured in QALYs. Thirdly, the cost consequence analysis, when there wasn't an attempt to combine the different outcomes that were assessed, but that the analysts and those involved in the analysis understood that there were lots of different outcomes that could be relevant to the decision maker, and presented all of these separately. And finally, what we call cost benefit analysis. This is particularly where the benefits are measured in monetary outcomes. So there are a whole range of different economic evaluations undertaken, and this is perhaps different to the standard economic evaluations where we look at pharmaceutical drugs and use NICE methodology, because really analysts are told to look at cost effectiveness per QALY for those kind of evaluations. That may be relevant and necessary for the social care economic evaluations, but many would argue that other outcomes count, and it's how we account for these in our analysis that matters here. So when we looked at the studies, we noticed that each of the studies compared two interventions. So this was often the new intervention compared to the standard care. In practice, though, it's not always clear, how many interventions or comparators are out there. And it's really important in economic evaluation to compare your new intervention to the most cost-effective alternative. Otherwise, it really skews the results that you're looking at. So there's a question mark there about, was it appropriate just to look at two interventions? Most of these studies used primary studies, that is, they collected their own data within the study. There's a whole range of different ways as economic evaluators we can use data and we can collect data. It could be from secondary sources, observational data, published literature as well. I was quite surprised that almost half of these studies used randomized trials to do the evaluations. I thought that was very encouraging, given that these are really amongst the most appropriate sort of methods for looking at the comparative effectiveness of interventions. The studies covered a range of methods and perspectives, from attempting to look at societal perspectives where all costs that were relevant were covered, to much narrower perspectives, specifically, for example, focusing on the social care sector, which certainly seems appropriate given these the interventions that we're looking at here. And the perspective is really important because it should be reflected in the resources that we capture and the costs attributed to them and the costs that we look at. Almost all of these studies used the unit of evaluation as the service user. And as you might expect, though, informal unpaid carer contributions were also important in this area, and indeed a third of the studies looked at either this just specifically or as well as service user participation and use of the service. And I saw earlier on the chat that there was a question about equity. Well, none of these studies explicitly explored equity, but as you can imagine, a lot of these interventions are targeted at those who have been needs assessed and financially assessed. So in some sense, perhaps there is an attempt through these very interventions to address equity, but there's clearly more considerations that could be taken into account in an analysis. If I could have the final slide, please, Michela. So what did we learn from this scoping study? Well, I divide this into considering the study setup, but also the key methods. In fact, though, my first bullet sort of relates to the study setup, but also to methods. It's a really essential part of setting up any economic evaluation is to consider the framework for the economic evaluation. One thing that's really common, and as I mentioned earlier, is that when we look at social care evaluations and social care interventions, and we want to understand their cost effectiveness, it's often that the impacts of the intervention don't just fall on the social care sector, they might fall more broadly. So for example, it might be that a social care intervention such as a home care intervention might have resource consequences and outcomes on the healthcare sector as well. So it might be important to look at that and try and include that within the analysis. So it's really just to say that it's really important to be explicit as an analyst to make it clear what sectors you're covering, who the evaluation is for, which stakeholders, as this will impact the perspective taken and the resource use and costs covered. Secondly, in terms of setup, it was really important to look at, what interventions were compared, and perhaps there's a role within academia to look at enhanced methods to both scope and identify the appropriate interventions for comparison, because it's not always that obvious as to which intervention should be compared. Thirdly, to consider data collection. This can be an immense challenge. I feel that over time, we're getting more data, not least through fantastic initiatives such as the Adult Social Care Outcomes Framework, but there's more to be done, and there's a really big resource and cost investment required in order to do this. The fourth point relates to the study design, and it's really important looking at social care interventions to be really careful about what study design is used. This might sound a real truism and something that's so obvious, but it is because it's not so plug-in. It's not like we're using NICE evaluation methods that look at pharmaceutical drugs and focusing explicitly and specifically on the healthcare perspective. And it's really important that, you know, to understand that whilst trials might be a fantastic vehicle for collecting data, it's sometimes unethical, infeasible to use that kind of design. And the last setup point I wanted to make really is that we had a call really as a result of the scoping review to consider, you know, further research capacity investment in the area, because it felt like a lot more was required as an investment to undertake successful social care economic evaluations. And my final 2 points really, there were a number of methods actually that we identified, but I just wanted to pick out 2 that were particularly key. One about a social care threshold. So usually when we do an economic evaluation, we use the NICE threshold if we're using NICE methods, and Annette referred to this when she talked about the £20,000 to £30,000 threshold. So in the situation where we have an intervention that has an additional benefit associated with it, but at an additional cost compared to its comparator, we need to see if it's sufficiently cost effective given this ceiling threshold that's provided by NICE. Well, this threshold is not really available currently in terms of a social care cost effectiveness threshold. So, I mean, I'd say as analysts, we've really had to be quite inventive and sort of test different thresholds that could be used, but there's also ongoing empirical research to try and find this. And lastly, but certainly very importantly, to think about appropriate outcome measures in the field. You know, Annette, through her case study, mentioned a few outcomes that were appropriate for advanced care planning. Certainly, it's probably unlikely to be the case that health-related quality of life is a sufficient outcome. And certainly in terms of the CARE Act, we're told very clearly that things like well-being are really important, or broader outcomes in the area. So that's one thing, another thing that this scoping review highlighted. So that brings me to the end of my presentation, and it's next to Ben, please. Thanks, Michela.
Thanks, Helen. Two very quick slides that I've put together, basically representing what's gone on since we launched the Essence website, toolkit website, back in the beginning of July last year. We've had a fairly consistent number of users come to the site, around 35 per week, about just under 900 in total. Majority of visits were from one-time visits, really. So people were coming to the site and not returning. We've got visits from across the world, but mainly United Kingdom. They tend to arrive via Google or direct. So that might be a link, or someone's been sent me website details in an email. We've also got some information about the searches that people are putting into Google, which they then click on. And they seem to be, in glossary terms, actually successful. So base case analysis, net monetary benefit, etc. So that's the user information, around about 900 since launch. Moving on to content. Next slide, please, Michela. Great. So although the user visits have been consistent, the amount of content that's been viewed per visit or over time has decreased. So you can see page views totaling around just under 5,000 since launch. The text on these is going to be quite small for you to see, I'm sure, on this presentation, but popular content is, again, net monetary benefit seems to be a good one. The case studies pages are popular, and then we can see which keywords or sections have been popular, with carers services at the top, home care next in line, reablement. I've included a graph over on the right to show that we saw at the beginning when Michela was showing us the map of services. This is the full list of NAO keywords, and you can see, and it's ordered by the number of page views that we're we're getting versus the number of evidence items we have. So the more evidence doesn't necessarily mean the most page views. It shows you in the light blue that, for instance, care as service is the most popular NIHR keyword. So that's really a snapshot of where we are, or where we are today, what's gone on the site since launch. If we could go forward to the next slide, please, Michela. So Essence 2, just around the corner, just about to kick off. And some of the, one of the tasks is going to be to increase the traffic to the site. And I've just noted 4 initiatives that we've discussed so far. And that is increase inbound links. So if you've got a piece of evidence that's related to your organization, you're a source, or if you're someone that's used that evidence, perhaps link into the site. We're going to invite suggestions for evidence or other enhancements to the site. We're going to create some sort of ongoing contact so that people that have visited the site will get notifications of new evidence items when they're added. And we're going to look at ways to enhance the site. So one of the things we're missing at the moment is a keyword search. Although you can navigate through to evidence, you have to do that via selecting a category. So we're going to add enhancements there. We also talked about adding in the possibility of creating a clipboard so you can save your own research items. So yeah, that's it for my bit. Thank you very much. Over to Martin.
Thank you, Ben. So I'm just going to say very quickly, because I want to get to the discussion. So as we've highlighted a couple of times, we're going to start a new project called Essence 2, imaginatively, from next week. And the idea is to continue doing what we've done so far. So you can see on there, just repeat some of the things in Michela's slide from earlier. So we're continuing to search for evidence on the economic case for different social care interventions. It doesn't have to be UK evidence. It can come from anywhere, as long as we think it's relevant to the UK. We will try to summarize it in a way which people can then find helpful. We will prepare some case studies, case summaries, rather, where that makes sense, where there's enough evidence to justify that, if you like. We are feeding into the capacity building role of the School for Social Care Research in providing training and learning materials. We'll run webinars like this. This was earlier than we expected to do in Essence 2, but we'll definitely do more of these and do more techie stuff later on. And we're very keen. Put in there in that side box, please get involved. Seriously, I mean, there's lots of people on the call here. It'd be great to hear your thoughts about what we could do better, what we could do new, anything of those kinds, any thoughts of those kinds. We need to set up some reference groups if you would like to be involved in some of those and help us as we go through over the next 3 years, 2 or 3 years. We'd be delighted to have your involvement. So I think next slide, please. Just to say that, so although some of Helen's work was funded through and supported by NICE, the 2 Essence projects are supported by the School for Social Care Research, therefore by NIHR, but what we've presented here is our own set of thoughts and ideas. So David, thank you. We've finished our presentation. Happy to go to whatever you want to do next.
Thank you, all of you. There are some questions, but perhaps just very briefly, in case anybody has to go, Martin, you welcomed involvement or contact. Who or how should people get in touch?
Well, certainly we'll make sure on the website, for the Essence website, there's an opportunity for people to kind of, well, we'll tell you on the website, but also you can just find me, email me. I'm happy to take any suggestions, and I'm open to most forms of comment, even slightly abusive, well, not abusive, but critical would be good. That's fine.
Thank you. Okay, so the first question, I'm taking the questions from the chat function, and this is from Francis D, and Helen touched on this, which was about the measurement of equity and fairness in a good social care system. Whether you could say something else about that.
Shall I just say something quickly, then perhaps Helen wants to come in. So I think there are 2 ways to think about this. It could be equity or fairness in relation to what kind of dimension. So is it in terms of need or unmet need or access to services or the gains, the outcomes you get from the services or paying for services. So it's those sorts of things. And then are there differences within the population? Are there differences by socioeconomic group or by gender or by ethnicity or by locality? So all of those things are relevant. And there are some summary measures that people have suggested for equity, which I'm not going to go into detail now, but there are some of those. But generally what you're talking about is then thinking about how those access, for example, how that varies across the population or the subpopulation. And it's important, I think, for researchers. As researchers, we tend to report the average result or the sort of core set of findings. We need to remember there are people that don't experience that average result. They may be disadvantaged or very advantaged, and we need to think about those distributions as well as the sort of average findings that we have.
Thanks, Martin, and thanks, Francis, for the question. I'll move on if I may, just so we can capture a few. Martin Routledge asked, what type of economic evaluation do the UK Treasury find persuasive? Thanks, Martin. I'll see you there.
An up-to-date one, a British one. They want something which has got clear indication of cashable consequences. So I think things which, if you've got a new intervention which has savings on quotes in terms of carer time or out-of-pocket payments, they might be less interested than if it was one which is going to reduce the public spending. I think what they are interested in are the sort of things you would expect them to be interested in. They're not, I mean, I don't think, well, people may disagree on this call, but my view is they're not narrowly concerned only with public spending. They are aware that other considerations are needed, but at the end of the day, their role is to advise government or to create policy which is concerned with the economic management of the country. So.
Okay, thank you. Sue, I think perhaps you had a question about who was using the Essence Toolkit, and I think perhaps that Ben's slides captured some of the information that may have been behind your question, but I didn't know if Ben or others wanted to say any more about the aspirations for reach or use.
Yeah, I can confirm we didn't capture in the analytics that we have. The users were anonymous, so we're not aware of their job role or their we have geographic location information, but not their organisation. And the initiatives that we're putting in place with some level of registration, we would want to gather that information so that we can get a good idea of the breakdown of users above and beyond the anonymous analytics we can capture.
Okay.
Yeah, just Martin coming in here. Just the other thing to say is in the first phase of Essence, it's very exploratory, I would say. I think we feel more confidence about how to take things forward, and we are very keen to hear from people. So although the traffic will be anonymized, the way that Ben says, we'll also make sure there's opportunities for people to send, to tell us things or to ask us things or suggest things, so that we can then try to gear what we're doing to the needs of different audiences. So we're happy to, as I say, happy to have any suggestions from today as well.
Okay, thank you. A question about whether is the social care community reluctant to engage with economic evaluation? I mean, it's a broad term. The social care community might be all kinds of different people, but is there a reluctance to engage with this? And if so, how? What should we do about that?
I don't want to hog this. Helen, do you want to say anything about this? From your scoping, maybe?
It was certainly a suggestion that came out of it, that research infrastructure and investing in those kind of communication tools and for enhancing engagement between the different stakeholders could only be helpful given the remit. So I think that because those research infrastructures tend to be more developed and historically in the sort of healthcare community, it'd be nice to learn from the best bits of that to see what we can do within the social care sector. I mean, my own personal experience working on economic evaluations of social care interventions, I've been very lucky to work with organisations such as the Social Policy Research Unit. So when you work with other researchers who know and have contacts with commissioners and local authorities and people who run sort of interventions in social care, that really helps us. And certainly as an economic evaluator, I don't feel it would have been possible for me to have fostered those relationships in quite the same way. So I think investment in those different stakeholders is really, really important. Thank you.
Lovely. Any other speakers got any comments on that?
The only thing I would say is, Martin, again, sorry, it's the point I made in my in the early bit of the presentation about different economic evaluations or different types of economic evidence being suitable for different purposes. And given the relatively limited amount of evidence, I think what we need to try to do is to make sure we, as a research community at least, are providing evidence which a range of different decision makers might need. Now, in one of the chats, Martin Routledge asked about, is this just central government or is it local government or others? Yes, we need to make sure that the evidence that we generate is helping people who face those difficult decisions. And I would also say that I think people that are self-funding want help in terms of what works, in terms of what is good for them in their circumstances. So I think we just need to be, the social care context is very complicated, much more so than the healthcare system, I would say, in this respect. And so we need, as researchers, to try to make sure we are helping those different types of audience.
Lovely. And thank you for including Martin's additional question there, Martin Knapp. That's great. It's 2 o'clock and I feel that we've covered quite a lot and had a really helpful and fascinating set of speakers. It's a lot to get into 1 hour, but thank you all very much for coming. Briefly, this has been recorded and the recording will be made available for you to look at again or to share. The next SSCR webinar is on the 10th of June and will be about ethics and social care research. But can I just thank again Martin, Michela, Annette, Helen and Ben, and draw the webinar to a close. So thank you very much indeed.